I was holding my mother's hand, adjusting the blanket over her feet because she always said the hospital kept the room too cold, when I heard my sister's voice carry across the nurse's station, loud enough that two women at the desk actually stopped typing. It was a Thursday. Not that the day of the week matters much, except that I remember it precisely. The way you remember precisely the day something breaks that can't be unbroken afterward. I'd come straight from a 12-hour shift, still in my uniform, tired in the specific way that settles into your shoulders after a long day of lifting stretchers and reassuring frightened strangers, looking forward to nothing more complicated than sitting quietly with my mother for an hour before heading home. "She's been robbing her blind," Claire said. "I want somebody official to write that down." I turned around slowly, still holding my mother's hand, and saw my sister standing in the doorway of the room, arms crossed, looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger you'd just caught doing something unforgivable. Behind her stood two cousins I hadn't seen in over a year, and my mother's oncologist, clipboard in hand, his expression somewhere between professional neutrality and genuine alarm. The fluorescent lights in that room had always felt a little too bright to me, the kind of lighting that makes everyone look slightly ill even when they aren't. And I remember thinking, absurdly, in that first frozen second, how strange it was that the room looked exactly the same as it had a moment earlier. The same beeping monitor, the same half-finished cup of ice chips on the tray table, while everything about my life had just shifted underneath me without a single object in that room moving at all. I need you to understand what the 2 years before that moment actually looked like, because it matters enormously for what came after. I am a paramedic. I have spent my entire career walking into the worst moments of strangers' lives and staying calm enough to be useful in them. I chose that career at 19, after riding along with a crew for a school project and realizing, somewhere in the middle of a call I still remember vividly, that I wanted to be the person who stayed steady when everyone else around me was falling apart. 15 years into that career, I'd built a reputation among my crew as the one who didn't rattle, the one newer medics got paired with on their first few rough calls, because I knew how to keep my voice level, even when my hands were doing something urgent. I bring that up because it matters for understanding exactly how strange it felt to have that same steadiness turned against me, treated not as a strength but as evidence of something calculated. There's an assumption people sometimes make about caregivers who don't show much visible distress, that our calm must mean we don't feel the weight of it the way others would, that steadiness is somehow suspicious in itself. I've thought about that assumption a lot since all of this happened. Nobody ever accused Claire of coldness for staying away for years. Nobody questioned her motives for showing up warm and tearful at first. It was my composure, ironically, the same composure that let me hold my mother's hand through countless bad days without falling apart in front of her, that somehow became, in Claire's telling, evidence that something wasn't right. I thought I understood what it meant to hold steady under pressure. I did not understand it, not really, until I heard my own sister accuse me, in front of my dying mother's medical team, of stealing from the woman I had spent every single day of the last 2 years keeping alive. This is the story of what happened after that accusation, and what came out once somebody finally looked at the footage. My name is Emma Castillo. I'm 36 years old. 2 years ago, my mother, Rosa, was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the kind of diagnosis that doesn't leave a lot of room for hope, only room for how you choose to spend the time that's left. I dropped my per diem shifts down to the bare minimum I needed to keep my certification current, and I moved into a caregiving rhythm that became, in every way that mattered, my second full-time job. I managed her medications on a schedule taped to the refrigerator. I drove her to every single appointment, sat through every consultation, asked every follow-up question the oncologist didn't have time to answer unless somebody pushed. I handled the finances because somebody had to, and because my mother trusted me with it the way she'd trusted me with most things since I was old enough to be trusted with anything. There were entire stretches of those 2 years that never made it into any story anyone would tell at a dinner table. The unglamorous middle of caregiving that nobody warns you about. The nights I slept in a recliner beside her hospital bed because she was scared of being alone after a bad round of chemo. The mornings I learned to change a feeding tube dressing because the home health aide couldn't always make it before my shift started. The specific, exhausting choreography of managing 12 different medications on 12 different schedules, while also trying to hold down a job that required me to be sharp enough to make life-or-death decisions on 4 hours of sleep. Nobody documents that kind of exhaustion in a notebook. You just live inside it, one day folding into the next, until eventually 2 years have passed, and you barely remember what your life looked like before it started. I want to be honest about how our relationship actually was before any of this happened, because it matters for understanding how blindsided I was. Claire and I hadn't spoken more than a handful of times in the 3 years before Mom's diagnosis. There was no dramatic falling out, no single fight either of us could point back to. It was just distance that accumulated the way distance does. Missed calls that turned into missed birthdays, that turned into an unspoken agreement neither of us ever said out loud. That we simply weren't going to be close anymore. I grieved that quietly, on my own time, the way you grieve something that never had a clean ending to mourn. I remember the exact night I got the call about Mom's diagnosis. I was on shift, sitting in the back of the ambulance between calls, and I stepped outside into the parking lot to take it because something in my mother's voice on the phone told me I needed to be standing still for whatever she was about to say. "Stage 4, she told me. "Pancreatic." The oncologist had used the word aggressive twice in the same sentence. I remember staring at the ambulance bay lights and doing math in my head. Treatment timelines, survival statistics I already half knew from work, trying to figure out how many good months we actually had left to work with. I called Claire that same night. She was kind on the phone, said all the right things, said she'd try to come visit soon. She didn't visit for another 1.5 years. My sister Claire is 3 years older than me. We were close once, a long time ago, back before she moved out of state in her 20s, chasing one relationship and then another, each one taking her further from home, further from phone calls that got returned within the week instead of the month. I won't pretend our relationship had been warm in recent years. It hadn't. But I also want to be honest that I never once, in 2 years of caregiving, expected it to turn into what it turned into. I expected distance. I expected missed birthdays and a certain low hum of resentment I'd learned to live with. I did not expect to be accused, in front of my mother's care team, of stealing from her. I should tell you about the kind of person I am, because it matters for understanding exactly how this whole situation was even possible in the first place. I keep records. It isn't a personality quirk so much as professional training bleeding into the rest of my life. In my job, you document everything. Because in an emergency, the difference between a vague memory and a precise timestamp can be the difference between a good outcome and a bad one. I kept a caregiving log from day 1 of my mother's diagnosis. Every medication given, every appointment attended, every dollar spent on her care, logged in a notebook I bought at the pharmacy the same week we got her diagnosis. I want to be clear that I did not start that log because I anticipated needing to defend myself someday. I started it because that's simply how I've always operated. The same instinct that makes me double-check a patient's vitals even when everything looks fine. It just happened, later, to become the exact thing that saved me. I remember the first entry, actually, because I still have the notebook. It was dated the day after Mom's diagnosis, in my own handwriting, slightly shakier than usual. Picked up oncology paperwork, filed with insurance, $40 copay, receipt attached. It looked almost absurdly mundane at the time. A woman doing arithmetic in the middle of the worst news of her life, because the arithmetic was the one thing that still made sense. 2 years later, that same mundane habit would be the difference between a courtroom believing me and a courtroom not believing me at all. Flipping through that notebook now, most of it reads like the world's least interesting diary. Gas for the drive to the oncology center, a receipt for a prescription copay, a note about a pharmacy that had run out of a particular medication and needed to order it from a supplier 3 towns over. None of it felt significant while I was writing it. All of it turned out to matter enormously, which is, I think, the truest thing I can say about caregiving in general. The significance is almost never visible from inside the day you're living it. Claire reappeared in our lives about 3 weeks before that scene in the hospital room. She called out of nowhere on a Tuesday evening, said she'd been thinking a lot about Mom, said she wanted to come see her, to reconnect, to be present for whatever time was left. I remember how carefully hopeful I let myself feel hearing that. My mother lit up on the phone telling me Claire was coming. For a few days, it felt like maybe some old wound in our family might actually have a chance to close before it was too late for it to matter. For a few days, it felt like maybe some old wound in our family might actually have a chance to close before it was too late for it to matter. I picked Claire up from the airport myself. The two of us, mostly quiet in the car on the drive back, both of us aware, I think, of how strange it felt to be sitting that close together again after so long. She asked about Mom's treatment schedule, asked genuinely thoughtful questions about pain management, cried a little in the passenger seat when I described how much weight Mom had lost since the last photo Claire had seen. I remember thinking, driving down that familiar highway exit, that maybe I'd been wrong to keep her at such a distance in my own mind all those years. Maybe people really could come back when it counted most. Claire showed up warm at first, genuinely warm, sitting at Mom's bedside for hours, holding her hand, asking about her pain levels, bringing her favorite magazines. I let myself relax around her in a way I hadn't in years. That's exactly the part I still think about looking back. I let my guard down at precisely the moment I probably shouldn't have. Within about a week, the questions started, small at first. Looking back, I can see the exact progression now in a way I couldn't while I was living through it. It started with Claire simply sitting in on one of Mom's financial review calls with the accountant, which seemed reasonable enough at the time, even thoughtful. I remember that first call clearly. The 3 of us on speakerphone with Mom's longtime accountant, a patient man named Roy who'd handled her taxes for over a decade. Claire asked good, sensible questions that afternoon. About deductible medical expenses, about whether the home modifications qualified for any tax relief. I remember feeling glad she was engaging, glad Mom had 2 daughters paying attention instead of just one. Roy even commented afterward, in a follow-up email, how nice it was to see both of you involved. I saved that email. I didn't know yet how much I'd need to remember exactly how normal that first call had actually felt. Then it was a question about a specific line item on a statement. Then a comment about how she'd always assumed things were more transparent between family. Then, within days, something closer to an interrogation disguised as concern. I didn't see the pattern forming because I was tired, and because some hopeful part of me still wanted to believe her interest came from love, rather than something else entirely. "How much is all this costing?" she asked me one evening, gesturing vaguely at the hospital room around us. "Who's managing the accounts these days?" I answered honestly, the way I always had, walking her through the general shape of things, the equipment costs, the in-home hospice modifications we'd had to make to the house, the medical bills that had piled up despite insurance covering what it covered. "Would you mind if I looked at the actual statements?" she asked, a few days after that. "Just for transparency. I think I have a right to understand what's happening with Mom's money, too." I told her I wasn't comfortable handing over unrestricted account access without talking to Mom about it first, given that Mom was still, in her clearer moments, entirely capable of making her own decisions about her own finances. It felt like a reasonable boundary to me. It did not feel reasonable to Claire. Within 2 days, I discovered that Claire had posted something in our extended family group chat, the one with aunts and cousins and a few of Mom's old friends from church. A message carefully worded to sound concerned rather than accusatory. I found out about the message the way I found out about most bad news that stretch. From a well-meaning aunt who called to ask, gently, if everything was all right, since Claire seemed worried. I opened the group chat myself after that call and scrolled up to find it, my thumb hovering over the screen, my stomach already sinking before I'd even finished reading the first line. She wrote that she had some questions about how Mom's finances were being handled that Emma doesn't seem willing to answer, and that she just wanted to make sure everything was being done properly, for Mom's sake. I read that message standing in my mother's kitchen at 11 at night, feeling something cold settle into my chest that I didn't yet have language for. I called Claire directly, tried to have an actual conversation about it, tried to explain that refusing unrestricted access wasn't the same thing as hiding something, that I simply believed our mother deserved a say in her own affairs while she was still capable of having one. I called Claire directly, tried to have an actual conversation about it, tried to explain that refusing unrestricted access wasn't the same thing as hiding something, that I simply believed our mother deserved a say in her own affairs while she was still capable of having one. "You've had control of everything for 2 years, Claire said, her voice tightening in a way I hadn't heard from her since we were teenagers. Don't act like this is suddenly about Mom's wishes. This is about you not wanting anyone looking too closely at what you've been doing. I've documented every single dollar, Claire. You can look at any of it, with Mom present, anytime you want. Convenient that you're the one deciding the terms of that," she said. "I'm not deciding the terms," I told her. "Mom is. She's still here, Claire. She still gets a say in her own money." Claire told me, in a tone I'd never heard from her before, that she found it very convenient I was suddenly citing Mom's wishes now, after 2 years of controlling everything myself. I hung up that call feeling like I'd just watched a door quietly close on something I hadn't even realized was still open. The guardianship petition came less than a week later. I found out about it the same way I found out about most things with Claire during that stretch, secondhand and unprepared. A cousin mentioned it in passing at a family dinner I almost didn't attend, said something about how Claire was worried enough about Mom's finances that she was talking to a lawyer. I remember sitting very still at that table, my fork halfway to my mouth, trying to process what I was hearing. The petition, once I actually saw it through my own attorney a few days later, cited a series of large withdrawals from Mom's accounts over the past 2 years, framed in a way that made them look exactly as suspicious as Claire clearly intended them to look. I remember reading it for the first time at my kitchen table, my own name appearing over and over in language I barely recognized as describing my life. Respondent withdrew. Respondent failed to provide documentation upon request. Respondent maintained sole control. Each phrase was technically accurate and completely divorced from any actual context, the legal equivalent of describing a surgeon's incision without mentioning the surgery. I set the document down at one point and had to walk outside into my own backyard just to breathe for a minute, because seeing 2 years of exhausting, careful sacrifice reduced to a paragraph of suspicious-sounding legalese felt like its own particular kind of violation. What the petition did not mention, conveniently, was that every single one of those withdrawals corresponded precisely to something in my caregiving log. The hospital bed we'd purchased when Mom could no longer manage the stairs. The wheelchair ramp we'd had installed at the front entrance. The home health aide we'd hired for 3 months during Mom's worst stretch of chemotherapy, back before hospice care took over more fully. Every dollar accounted for, every dollar documented, every dollar spent exactly the way any reasonable person would expect money to be spent on a woman dying of cancer who wanted, more than anything, to stay in her own home for as long as possible. That didn't stop the accusation from landing exactly the way Claire intended it to land, in front of an audience that had no access to any of that context. The scene in the hospital room, the one I started this story with, happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Claire had arranged, deliberately I now believe, to arrive at the same time as Mom's oncologist's scheduled visit, along with 2 cousins she'd apparently invited under some pretense of a family visit. I was adjusting my mother's blanket when Claire walked in, took one look at the room full of witnesses, and said the words I will never forget for the rest of my life. "She's been robbing her blind. I want somebody official to write that down." The oncologist's face went carefully neutral in the way medical professionals train themselves to do when a situation suddenly becomes unpredictable. One of my cousins actually took a half step back toward the door, like the accusation itself might be contagious. My mother, weak from her most recent treatment, tried to lift her head off the pillow, tried to say something, and managed only a few faint words before the effort exhausted her. "That's not true," she whispered. "Emma would never." The oncologist cleared his throat and said something about needing to step out and let the family sort this privately. The particular escape maneuver medical professionals develop for exactly these situations. One of the cousins, Marcus, wouldn't quite meet my eyes on his way out the door, and I remember thinking, even in that moment, that he looked more uncomfortable than convinced, like a man who'd been handed a story he hadn't fully examined before agreeing to stand behind it. It wasn't enough. Not in that room, not in that moment. A dying woman's whispered defense doesn't carry the same weight, apparently, as a healthy woman's loud accusation. I stood there, holding my mother's hand, my professional composure the only thing keeping me from either shouting or breaking down completely in front of everyone. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that I was no longer simply my mother's caregiver. I was now, in the eyes of at least some of the people in that room, a suspect. I want to walk you through the weeks that followed, because they were, in many ways, harder than that single humiliating afternoon. Humiliation is sharp but brief. What came after was slow and grinding. I retained my own attorney, a guardianship specialist named Denise Okafor, who I found through a referral from a coworker whose family had gone through something similar years earlier. I retained my own attorney, a guardianship specialist named Denise Okafor, who I found through a referral from a coworker whose family had gone through something similar years earlier. I met her for the first time in a small conference room that smelled like printer toner, my caregiving notebook sitting in my lap like something fragile. She introduced herself, shook my hand firmly, and told me before we'd even sat down that she'd seen a lot of guardianship disputes in her career, and that the vast majority of them came down to one question: which side actually kept records? She asked me directly whether I had anything in writing at all documenting the last 2 years. I handed her the notebook without a word. Denise was calm in the exact way I try to be calm with patients. Steady, unhurried, focused entirely on what could actually be proven rather than what merely felt unjust. The first thing she asked me for was documentation. I handed her the notebook I'd kept since day one. 2 years of handwritten entries, dates, dollar amounts, receipts taped into the margins, every single expenditure cross-referenced against the specific medical or care need it addressed. She looked through maybe the first 20 pages before she looked up at me with an expression I can only describe as quiet relief. "This is going to matter enormously," she told me. "Most people in your position don't have anything close to this level of detail. You may have just handed me the entire case." I told her I hadn't kept the log for this reason. I'd kept it because it was simply how I operated. She told me that didn't matter at all, that the reason didn't change how useful it was, only the fact that I happened to be the kind of person who did this instinctively, rather than defensively. The professional stakes, though, went beyond the guardianship petition itself. My employer, once informed of the accusation through channels I still don't fully understand, informed me that my paramedic certification would be placed under an internal review pending the outcome of the guardianship hearing. Elder financial abuse, even alleged, even unproven, is the kind of accusation that licensing boards take seriously by default, because they have to. I understood that logically. Understanding it logically did not make it feel any less like the ground disappearing beneath a second part of my life at the exact same time the first part was already under attack. I understood that logically. Understanding it logically did not make it feel any less like the ground disappearing beneath a second part of my life at the exact same time the first part was already under attack. A coworker named Priya, one of the newer medics I'd trained the year before, found me in the break room one afternoon during this stretch, staring at my phone without really seeing it. She sat down across from me without saying much at first, just company. The kind good coworkers know how to offer without making a person explain themselves before they're ready. Eventually, I told her a little of what was happening: the petition, the review, the accusation. She was quiet for a moment, then said something I still think about. "You taught me that the calmest person in the room is usually the one carrying the most, not the one carrying the least. I think whoever's investigating this ought to know that about you before they decide anything." It wasn't legal advice. It wasn't evidence. It was just a colleague reminding me, at a moment I badly needed reminding, that the people who actually knew me hadn't stopped believing in who I was, whatever a courtroom eventually decided. My shift supervisor called me into his office the week the review started. A man named Frank, who I'd worked alongside for almost 9 years, who looked genuinely uncomfortable delivering the news. "This isn't me thinking you did anything, Emma," he told me, sliding a piece of paper across his desk. "This is policy. Any elder financial abuse allegation, substantiated or not, triggers an automatic review." I know how that sounds, I'm sorry. I signed the acknowledgement form with a hand that wasn't quite steady and drove home that night wondering, for the first time in my career, whether a job I'd built my entire adult identity around might actually be taken from me over something I had never done. I remember sitting in my car in the hospital parking garage one evening, engine off, both hands on the steering wheel, doing the specific breathing exercises I use to talk frightened patients down from panic. Except this time, I was the patient, and there was nobody else in the vehicle to talk me through it but myself. I sat there long enough that the automatic garage lights on my level cycled off from lack of movement, plunging the car into near darkness before flickering back on when I finally shifted in my seat. I thought about calling Dan, a coworker I trust, just to hear a voice that wasn't wrapped up in any of this. I didn't call him. I don't fully know why, except that some part of me still needed to sit alone with exactly how frightened I was before I could let anyone else see it. The same instinct, I suppose, that had me documenting receipts in a notebook instead of asking anyone for reassurance along the way. My mother had a clear afternoon, about 2 weeks into all of this, one of those windows where the medication and the disease briefly aligned to give her back something close to her old clarity. Those windows had become rarer by that point in her illness, and every person who cares for someone with a terminal diagnosis learns, eventually, to recognize them for what they are: borrowed time, a gift with an unpredictable expiration. I remember walking into her room that afternoon and immediately noticing the difference in her eyes: sharper, more present, the particular alertness she used to have before any of this started. I sat down beside her bed right away, some instinct telling me not to waste a single minute of whatever clarity she had left that day. She asked me to sit with her, held my hand the way she used to when I was small and frightened of thunderstorms, and told me, in a voice stronger than I'd heard from her in weeks, that she knew the truth, that she had always known the truth, and that whatever happened at that hearing, I needed to understand she believed me completely. "I'm too weak to stand up in that courtroom and say it myself," she told me, her eyes wet. but I need you to know I would, if I could. Do you remember, she said, when you were 7 and you broke Mrs. Halloran's window with that softball, and you told me the truth before anyone even asked you? You've never once in your whole life needed to lie your way out of anything, Emma. I don't understand how anyone who knows you could believe otherwise. I told her Claire didn't really know me anymore. Hadn't for a long time. That's the saddest part of all this, my mother said quietly. Not the money, not the lawyers, just that. I told her I knew that. I told her it was enough just hearing her say it, even though some small, exhausted part of me wished desperately that it could actually be enough, legally, the way it was enough emotionally. It wasn't. Courts do not run on a dying woman's whispered faith in her daughter. They run on evidence. It was during this stretch, digging through old paperwork one night, trying to understand exactly how Claire had assembled the specific withdrawals she'd cited in her petition, that I remembered the home security system. We'd installed cameras at Mom's house about a year and a half earlier, after a minor break-in scare in the neighborhood, mostly aimed at the front door and the driveway. Nothing invasive, nothing pointed at anything private. I'd forgotten, in the chaos of everything else, that the system also logged remote access to Mom's linked financial accounts through the same home network, a feature I'd set up originally just so I could monitor for any suspicious activity while Mom was in the hospital for extended stretches. I remember the exact moment I opened that Access Log app on my phone, sitting alone at Mom's kitchen table at nearly midnight, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the oxygen concentrator running down the hall. I almost didn't check it at all. I'd genuinely forgotten it even monitored account activity, not just the front door camera feed, until I was scrolling through the app's settings menu looking for something else entirely, and noticed a tab I'd never opened, labeled simply, Linked Account Activity. I sat at the kitchen table at nearly midnight, scrolling through months of access logs, and found something that made my stomach drop in a completely different direction than everything else had that month. A series of remote logins to Mom's primary checking account, time-stamped over the previous 4 months, originating from an IP address I didn't recognize. Small withdrawals, nothing as large as the ones Claire had cited in her petition against me, but withdrawals nonetheless, 200 here, 300 there, timed in a pattern that, once I mapped it against a calendar, aligned almost perfectly with the weeks immediately preceding Claire's sudden reappearance in our lives. My hands were actually shaking, taking screenshots of each entry, dating each one, exporting the whole log to a file before I could talk myself into believing I'd misread something. I did not sleep at all that night. I sat with that discovery for a long time before I called Denise the next morning. It took her firm's investigator less than a week to confirm what I already suspected. The IP address traced back to an apartment complex 3 states away, the same city Claire had been living in before she reconnected with our family. Denise called me with the full report on a Thursday afternoon, and I remember pacing the length of my kitchen while she read through it, unable to sit still. I'd waited 3 days for that call after her investigator first mentioned they had something significant to share. 3 days of trying to keep my hands busy at work, of double-checking equipment on the ambulance more times than strictly necessary, of lying awake running through every possible version of what significant might mean. When my phone finally rang that Thursday afternoon, I nearly dropped it answering. The investigator had pulled a public eviction filing against Claire, dated 4 months prior to her return, a defaulted auto loan sent to collections, and a pattern of overdraft fees on Claire's own accounts stretching back nearly a year. Denise read each finding out loud in the same measured tone she used for everything, and I found myself gripping the edge of my counter harder with each one. She was drowning, Denise said, not unkindly, and she found an account she still technically had legacy access to from years back. before you tightened the permissions during your original caregiving setup. People in that position don't always make good decisions, Emma. That doesn't excuse what she did to you, but it explains it. Further digging, the kind Denise's firm was equipped to do that I wasn't, turned up a pattern of significant personal debt on Claire's side. A defaulted car loan, a landlord dispute over unpaid rent, the specific financial desperation of someone who had run out of options and found, in a mother slowly dying 3 states away, an account she still technically had legacy access to from years earlier, back before I'd tightened the permissions during my initial caregiving setup. Claire hadn't come home to reconnect. Claire had come home because she needed money, had already been quietly taking small amounts of it for months before she ever set foot back in our mother's house, and had constructed the entire accusation against me, I now believe, as a preemptive strike, a way to make sure that if anyone ever noticed unusual activity on that account, the suspicion would land squarely on me instead of on her. I want to be honest about how that discovery felt, because it wasn't clean vindication. Not entirely. There was relief, real relief, the kind that comes with finally understanding the shape of a threat you'd been fighting blind. But there was also a grief underneath it that took me by surprise. Grief for the sister I'd let myself hope, for one brief week, might actually be coming home for the reasons she claimed. I sat with that grief for a couple of days before I told anyone besides Denise, turning it over in my mind, the way you turn over a bruise to see if it still hurts the same way it did yesterday. I thought about the drive back from the airport, how genuinely moved she'd seemed hearing about Mom's weight loss, and I had to accept the uncomfortable possibility that some of that had probably even been real. A woman capable of real feeling who was, at the exact same time, already quietly taking money from the account of the person she claimed to be grieving over. Both things were true. That was, in some ways, the hardest part to sit with. Harder even than the accusation itself. I told Dan, my closest friend from the crew, about it over coffee one morning before shift, mostly because I needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't billing me by the hour to listen. He didn't offer much advice, just listened, then said quietly that some people learn to survive by making sure somebody else looks worse than they do. I've thought about that description many times since. It fit better than anything else I could come up with on my own. In the days leading up to the hearing, Claire kept escalating, reaching out to a handful of extended family members with careful, sympathetic-sounding messages that painted herself as the concerned daughter, finally stepping in where nobody else would. Marcus, the cousin who'd been present that day in the hospital room, called me one evening, sounding uncertain in a way that told me he hadn't fully thought through what he'd agreed to. Claire asked me to write a statement, he told me, about that day at the hospital, about how it looked to me. And what did you tell her? I asked. I told her I'd think about it, he said. Honestly, Emma, I don't know what I actually saw that day besides 2 sisters fighting. I don't want to get in the middle of something I don't fully understand. Then don't sign anything you don't fully understand, I told him. That's all I'd ask. He didn't end up submitting a statement either way, which felt, at the time, like a small mercy I hadn't expected. Not everyone in my extended family sided with Claire's version immediately. Some of them simply chose not to take a side at all, which, given everything else happening, was about the most I could reasonably ask for from people who hadn't seen the receipts I had. The guardianship hearing took place on a Tuesday morning in a county courthouse that smelled faintly of old carpet and coffee from the machine in the hallway. I sat beside Denise at a long wooden table, my notebook and a binder of exhibits stacked neatly in front of us, my hands folded tightly in my lap to keep them from shaking. Claire arrived with her own attorney, dressed carefully, composed in a way that almost made me doubt, for one unsettling moment, everything Denise's investigator had found. The judge, an older woman with reading glasses pushed low on her nose, opened the proceedings by asking Claire's attorney to summarize the petition's basis. The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic spaces you see on television. Rows of mismatched chairs, a flag in the corner that had clearly seen better decades, a clock on the wall ticking loudly enough that I found myself watching it more than I meant to during the quieter stretches of testimony. Denise had warned me beforehand that guardianship hearings rarely feel cinematic, that they're mostly paperwork and patience, and she was right. It didn't make it feel any less like the most important morning of my life. He walked through the withdrawal amounts I already knew by heart at that point, framing them exactly the way Claire had originally framed them in the family group chat. Careful, concerned, transparency-seeking language wrapped around an accusation with no context attached. Denise presented my caregiving log first, methodically walking the judge through 2 years of entries, cross-referencing them against actual receipts and medical invoices submitted as exhibits. She held up the hospital bed purchase receipt beside the corresponding withdrawal Claire had cited, then the wheelchair ramp installation invoice beside another, then the home health aides payment records beside a third. I watched the judge's expression shift somewhere around the 15-minute mark, from careful neutrality to something closer to genuine attention. Denise presented my caregiving log first, methodically walking the judge through 2 years of entries, cross-referencing them against actual receipts and medical invoices submitted as exhibits. I watched the judge's expression shift somewhere around the 15-minute mark, from careful neutrality to something closer to genuine attention. Then Denise presented the security system logs. I watched Claire's face change the moment the investigator's report was introduced into evidence. The specific timestamps, the IP address, the pattern of withdrawals that predated her return by months. Her attorney asked for a brief recess. When the hearing resumed, the tone in that courtroom had shifted entirely. The judge dismissed Claire's guardianship petition outright and referred the matter of the unauthorized withdrawals for further review by the appropriate financial fraud authorities, a process that, Denise told me afterward, would likely take months to fully resolve, but had already accomplished the single most important thing, which was clearing my name and my mother's care arrangement of any further legal challenge. I remember the judge's exact words before she moved to the next item on her docket that morning. Something about how the record before her showed a caregiver who had documented her mother's care with a level of diligence rarely seen in these proceedings, and a petition built on a selective reading of that same record. It wasn't dramatic. Courtrooms rarely are, in my experience since. It was just a tired, competent woman doing her job carefully. And in doing it carefully, she gave me back something Claire's accusation had taken from me in that hospital room months earlier, which was simply the presumption that I was telling the truth. I found Claire outside the courthouse afterward, standing alone near the parking structure, her composure from the hearing finally cracking around the edges. "I needed it," she said, before I'd even said anything to her. "I needed it more than she did. She's dying anyway, Emma. What difference does it make where the money goes at this point?" "You didn't just take the money quietly, Claire," I said. "You accused me of taking it, in front of her doctor, in front of her family, while she was lying in that bed trying to defend me with the little strength she had left." "I panicked," Claire said, her voice cracking now too. "I saw an opening to make the questions go away from me and I took it. I know how that sounds. It sounds exactly like what it was," I told her. She looked away, out toward the parking lot, and for a moment I thought maybe something real might finally come out of her. Some actual acknowledgement instead of another justification. It didn't come. "Do you even understand what the last 2 years were like for me?" I asked her, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. Not the money, the actual days, the 3 a.m. medication schedules, the nights I slept in a chair so she wouldn't wake up alone. "You weren't there for any of it, Claire. And then you showed up and decided you understood it better than I did." "I know I wasn't there," she said, quietly, for the first time sounding like she meant something instead of performing it. "I don't have a good excuse for that either." That, at least, felt closer to true than anything else she'd said to me in months. It still wasn't an apology. I didn't wait around to see if one was coming. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the fact that even now, confronted directly with what she'd done, she couldn't find her way to actual accountability, only justification. I didn't shout at her. I didn't need to. It made all the difference in the world to her, I told Claire. Every single dollar mattered to her comfort, to her dignity, to the time she has left. You don't get to decide that didn't matter just because you needed it to not matter. Claire didn't have a response to that. She got in her car and left, and that was, as it turned out, the last real conversation we've had. My mother passed away 6 weeks after that hearing, peacefully, at home, in the bed we'd bought with money Claire had once tried to convince a courtroom I'd stolen. Those 6 weeks were, in their own quiet way, the best stretch of the entire 2 years. Not because anything got easier physically, but because for the first time since Claire's return, there was no lawyer to call, no petition hanging over every conversation. Just my mother and me and the hospice nurse who came by twice a week, and long afternoons where we talked about nothing important at all, which turned out to be exactly what we both needed most. We watched old game shows together some afternoons, the kind she used to watch when I was a kid homesick from school, and she'd still call out answers half a second before the contestants did, her voice thinner than it used to be, but the timing exactly the same. We looked through old photo albums on the good days, her narrating stories behind pictures I'd heard 100 times before, and somehow still wanted to hear again. I've thought since about how strange it is that some of my most peaceful memories of that entire 2-year stretch come from its very final weeks, after everything with Claire had already been decided, when there was finally nothing left to defend and only the two of us left to simply be with each other. She asked me one afternoon, out of nowhere, whether I was angry at Claire. I told her I was still figuring that out. She told me that was allowed, that I didn't owe anybody a tidy answer about it, not even her. I was holding her hand when she went, the same way I'd been holding it the day everything started falling apart in that hospital room months earlier. I want to tell you that the legal vindication was the most important part of this whole story, but it wasn't. The most important part was that my mother's final months were not derailed by a guardianship battle, were not spent worrying about lawyers and hearings instead of simply being cared for by the daughter who never left. I set a boundary with Claire after the funeral that I have not moved from since. She texted me twice in the first month after Mom died. Both times short, both times carefully worded, testing the waters without quite apologizing. The first said simply, "Thinking of you. Hope you're doing okay." The second, a few weeks later, asked whether I'd found any of Mom's old photo albums, framed as though it were an innocent, sisterly question completely unconnected to everything else. I didn't respond to either one. It wasn't spite. It was clarity. The specific kind of clarity that only arrives after you've watched someone choose, repeatedly, to protect themselves at your expense, and you finally accept that the pattern isn't going to change just because enough time has passed to make it feel awkward not to respond. I don't take her calls. I don't respond to the occasional message that arrives, usually vague, usually testing whether enough time has passed for things to go back to normal. There is no normal to go back to, not after this. I'm not interested in revenge against my sister. The financial fraud investigation is proceeding through its own channels without any further involvement from me beyond what the authorities require. I'm interested, instead, in protecting whatever peace I have left to protect. My paramedic certification was cleared of any review within a month of the hearing's outcome, once the licensing board received the court's findings. Frank called me into his office again, the same room where he'd handed me that acknowledgement form months earlier, and this time slid a different piece of paper across the desk. the formal closure notice on the review. "I'm glad this is over," he told me. "For what it's worth, nobody on this team ever doubted you. Policy just doesn't leave room for that kind of trust. Not officially." I told him I understood. I did understand. I just also understood, for the first time really, how quickly a policy designed to protect vulnerable people could be turned into a weapon against someone who'd spent 2 years protecting one. I went back to full shifts a few weeks after the funeral, back to walking into strangers' worst moments and staying steady enough to be useful in them, which is, I've come to understand, the only kind of steadiness I ever actually wanted credit for. The first call I responded to after coming back was, oddly, almost nothing. A minor fall at a grocery store. An elderly man who mostly just needed reassurance and an ice pack more than any real medical intervention. I remember kneeling beside him on that linoleum floor, checking his vitals, talking him calmly through what came next, and feeling something settle back into place inside me that had been unsteady for months. This, at least, I still knew how to do. This, at least, nobody could take a courtroom to argue me out of. Not the kind that gets accused in a hospital hallway. The kind that shows up, quietly, every single day, whether or not anybody happens to be watching, or keeping score, or waiting for a chance to say otherwise. That's the part nobody tells you about being the one who stays. You don't do it to be believed. You do it because somebody has to, and it happened to be you. The believing, when it finally comes, is just a bonus you never actually needed in order to know you did the right thing all along. I visit my mother's grave most Sundays now, usually alone, sometimes with a coffee I don't finish, and I talk to her the way I used to talk to her in that hospital room during the quiet stretches between appointments. About nothing important. About the weather. About a difficult call I ran that week. I don't talk about Claire much anymore, not because I'm avoiding it, but because there simply isn't much left to say. Some doors close not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click, and you only notice afterward how much lighter you feel not having to keep pushing against them anymore. I kept the notebook. It sits in a drawer in my kitchen now. 2 years of small, careful handwriting that once felt like nothing more than habit and ended up being the only thing standing between me and losing everything I'd spent those 2 years protecting. I don't know if I'll ever need a notebook like that again. I hope I won't. But I know now, in a way I didn't before any of this happened, that the quiet, unglamorous habit of simply telling the truth in writing, every single day, whether or not anyone is watching, is sometimes the only defense you get. It was enough. In the end, it was enough.